Thank you very much, Gabby, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night to everyone, wherever you are. Thanks so much. There's almost 50 people here already, so it's wonderful to see so many people come to the first of our speaker events this year. These events are hosted by our charity, Modern Money Lab. We set up Modern Money Lab 5 years ago to give people the chance to explore an economics relevant to the pursuit of ecological, social, and global justice in the 21st century. And in partnership with one of our local universities, Torrens, we offer global online graduate certificate, diploma, and master's degree courses in the economics of sustainability, built on modern money theory and ecological economics. Several of the faculty are world leaders in their subjects, and the diversity and quality of students on the courses, many of whom are here with us now, is beyond compare. We'd love it if you were to join us. So if you'd like to find out more about the courses, then get in touch with Gabby or me. Our speaker today is one of the most prominent younger modern money theory economists, Yeva Nersisyan. Yeva is Associate Professor of Economics at Franklin and Marshall College in Pennsylvania and a research scholar at the Levy Economics Institute at Bard College in New York. She is the co-editor of the fairly recently published Elgar Companion to Modern Money Theory with Randy Wray, and also co-author with him of the influential paper, Can We Afford the Green New Deal?, which anyone can read a sort of draft version of on the Levy Economics site, which was in the Journal of Post-Keynesian Economics in 2021, and which is closely related to what she's going to talk to us about today. So I'd like to give a warm welcome to Yeva.
Thank you, Stephen, for that kind introduction, and to everyone for coming. This is a lot of people. I did not realize this is good attendance. Happy to be here and to talk to you about the Green New Deal, although the prospects of it happening are looking glimmer and glimmer by the day. I remember when we first published the paper, I was really optimistic. It was a different kind of time, and there was hope that some of it could actually be realized. And now we kind of have to fight for what we have to keep what we have, right? Rather than getting anything new, unfortunately. So let me, on that optimistic note, let me go ahead and get started. So the impetus for the paper on which this talk is based was Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in the United States, together with some other politicians, talking about a Green New Deal, a comprehensive approach to trying to solve a lot of the problems, including climate change that the U.S. economy was facing or is still facing. And that kind of threw a lot of the conservative think tanks into a frenzy of trying to say why we cannot do a Green New Deal, why it would be too expensive to afford, and so on and so forth. So we said, well, what would be an MMT approach to trying to evaluate whether the Green New Deal was affordable? And MMT always had the focus on the real resources rather than money, but what would that mean in practical terms if we were evaluating a program like the Green New Deal? That was the purpose for the paper. And so the Green New Deal obviously echoes the original New Deal, which was a comprehensive set of reforms that the FDR administration implemented in the US during the Great Depression and many years afterwards. And it really created the modern US economy, or set the stage for the modern US economy. And when we say comprehensive, it was really comprehensive. So it included the creation of FDIC on the one hand, and the Glass-Steagall Act, right? And then the creation of Social Security and all the jobs programs that I'm sure you're familiar with. So it was really, really major and comprehensive. And so the Green New Deal was supposed to be comprehensive in that way as well, although different people mean different things when they say Green New Deal. So for instance, in Europe, generally, that was meant to be just greening the economy, fighting climate change, while in the US, at least the AOC version was to have something more comprehensive that included things like universal health care, so things that Europeans have, but we don't have here in the United States, for instance, but also something that's been part and parcel of MMT for a long time, the job guarantee, and other social programs like childcare, free college or subsidized college, and so on and so forth, and then ending the forever wars that the U.S. economy or the U.S. as a country has been engaging in for a long time. So the mainstream approach was to immediately cost the Green New Deal in financial terms and say, okay, well, you want all of these programs like universal health care and job guarantee and greening the economy. How much would that actually cost? And so they would basically estimate the costs, and the most expensive component happened to be the Medicare for All and the job guarantee. So the greening portion actually was the cheapest component of the Green New Deal, according to even this conservative think tank estimates. But the approach was to add all of the costs, take all of these costs and then add them together and say, this is how much it's going to cost. And then one number that was very much publicized was $93 trillion. It's going to cost us $93 trillion over 10 years. It's not doable. We cannot have that kind of money, and it would be a confiscatory level of taxes, even if that we would need to be able to afford something like that. And of course, if we cannot raise taxes, the alternative is always we have to go into debt and borrow, and that's unsustainable. We do hear the alarm bells go off about the deficit every once in a while when it's politically convenient for whatever group here in the U.S. So, and then there is generally this view that because it's so costly, the government cannot do it alone. We have to bring in the private sector. We have to rely on private finance, right? A lot of what we would call leftists or progressives basically buy into this story, which is a little infuriating, that we have to recruit private finance because we don't have the money to do it, and there is no alternative to that. So the after all of this, right, the scaremongering and that we don't have the money and so on, and then COVID happened, right? And then what did the government do? It appropriated $5 trillion, a round number. Not now, not exactly 5 trillion was spent, but that's how much Congress appropriated. And they did that in a matter of a year, right? So although we don't have money, the stuff before that was all put aside, right? And we appropriated $5 trillion. And I said, here, it's an emergency. We need it. We're just going to do it. Well, I think that should cause people to reevaluate, obviously, and a lot of what was said about government spending previously. And of course, all of you are familiar with MMT, so I'm not going to go too much into that. But the short of it is that we didn't find the money from anywhere, right? We just created it. The government spent it into existence. It didn't exist before. It wasn't saved anywhere and was spent, right? It was just created in the process of being spent. And of course, there is that misinterpretation of MMT that MMT just advocates for let's print money and spend, as if it's some kind of new way of spending. MMT has discovered a new way of spending, right? Which is a misunderstanding of MMT. It's not a new way of spending. It's just elucidating how the government actually spends by creating money. It's a description of what happens. What didn't happen is what mainstream economic theory says will happen if the government overspends, such as skyrocketing interest rates, right? The government being forced to default, the bond markets refusing to lend to the government. None of that actually happened. Interest rates did go up eventually, not because of financial markets, but because the central bank started raising interest rates. And that's when government's financing costs, so to speak, went up, right? So finding the money is not the problem. Finding the real stuff that you need is what's difficult. And that's the focus of our paper here. So the JFAC Foster quote, which you may have already seen, whatever's technologically possible is financially feasible, is really the MMT framework for evaluating the affordability of any kind of government program, but the Green New Deal in particular, because nations don't pay for things in terms of money, they pay for things in real terms. And money is just that tool that you need and that you use to mobilize the real resources and to sometimes create the real resources, because there is this conception that the resources are fixed, and that's actually not true. What is considered a resource very much depends on the technology you have. If you don't have technology to harness energy from the sun, then that's really not a resource. If you don't have technology to use oil, right, then oil is really not a resource. So what is a resource? What is not a resource, right? Then that's also a very elastic concept. All right. So the affordability of the Green New Deal depends on whether we have the resources. And the important point that MMT always has made is that just because the government is spending more doesn't actually mean we would be using more of our real resources. It's possible for the government to spend more, but at the same time, the society as a whole is actually saving not money, but resources, which is what's really, relatively speaking, scarce. So, how do we find, how much of the resources do we need to devote to fighting climate change, right? And implementing this comprehensive set of reforms? Do we have them? And if we don't have them, how do we create them, right? And of course, for a very long time, the US economy didn't have a problem of having resource scarcity, especially after the global financial crisis, and this graph shows that, right? So we have our potential GDP and our actual GDP, and this shaded area right here is your Great Recession after the or during the global financial crisis, and you can see how much our actual GDP was below our potential for a very long time, and you can even see that we had reduced our estimates of the potential there, right? So we had lowered our target, and even then we were falling far, far short of that target for about 10, 11 years, right, after the financial crisis or after the start of the recession. And so we had all that potential, all those resources, all those unemployed people who were there, who we could have used to green our economy, and that was such a wasted opportunity. And now we're reaping the political consequences of that, and the backlash to that kind of anemic economic recovery. But back to the affordability question, right? So the obviously this graph is not has a lot of issues, how we measure potential GDP and so on and so forth. But to think about the real resource space, right, in MMT terms, if your economy is already at the potential, you could say you are at some kind of full employment. And again, here we can have a disagreement about, well, is 4% unemployment actually full employment, or can we do more? And the MMT, of course, approaches, yes, you can do more through a job guarantee. But if you're here, you can say, okay, this is where we have to be careful about how much of our resources we can devote to a new program, right? But if you're here, clearly you don't have a problem of scarcity of resources, right? In macro terms, you could have a scarcity of certain things, right? And again, I'll get into that, but you generally don't have a problem of scarce resources, okay? So in an economy like this, you can't really say we can't afford to do things like Green New Deal, right? Because you have ample resources to do it to begin with. And this is where you may say, okay, maybe we have to take it slower than in other situations, okay? All right, so I'm going to obviously explain all of this in more detail, just to show you some of our numbers that we came up with, and also show you that some programs, as I said, would actually be saving us resources rather than costing us resources. So the main things that we included in our calculations were greening the economy, which we said is going to be largely a use of resources, although there could be some savings there too, because we would be moving away from fossil fuels. So we would be spending less of our resources on fossil fuels. And then there's universal health care, which, as I said, according to those conservative estimates, was supposed to be one of the costliest, or if not the most costly portion of the whole Green New Deal package, which actually, from MMT perspective, would be reducing total spending in the economy. So in other words, it would actually be deflationary. It would be releasing resources rather than being a demand on resources. And then the job guarantee can be both a source and use of resources. So we have to net that out there as well. And obviously ending the forever wars would be a big source of savings in terms of resources, although usually that's framed in terms of money, obviously. So the advantage of the comprehensive package then was that not only are you tackling all of these issues at the same time, but you're doing it in a way where you are releasing resources as you need them, right? So you're not just releasing resources and leaving them unemployed. You're releasing them at the same time that you actually need them to do other things such as green the economy. Okay. All right. So the first one, greening the economy, which we said would be largely use of resources. We'll look at a bunch of different estimates. And of course, these numbers at this point are outdated. Janet Yellen, when she was Treasury Secretary, she said that we are going to need about $3 trillion globally for until 2050, pretty much, if we were to fight climate change and completely transition to a renewable, greener economy. That comes to about 10% of US GDP, but those are the global numbers, right? So you could say that 5% of GDP, that's still a pretty realistic number if we're thinking about the US economy. So 5% of GDP spent for 10 years, every year in the course of 10 years. And you can see here that we're subtracting the fossil fuel investments that we would no longer be doing, right? So this is, again, when you're doing the just the financial math, right, on this, you're not doing that. You're not saying, well, what about all the resources that we won't be spending on fossil fuel investments, right? Well, in real resource terms, that's a saving that you're not going to see reflected when you're just looking at the financial costs and adding them up. Okay. Now, the interesting case here, which is interesting from an MMT perspective, or where MMT has an interesting take, is the Medicare for All, right? And of course, the US is well known for being one of the only so-called developed countries that does not have some kind of universal healthcare system, right? Or a single payer kind of system. And of course, that leads to a situation that you see in this graph where you don't have to read what's on the bottom to know which one is the United States, right? So the United States is a clear outlier in terms of how much of our resources we're devoting to healthcare, and we don't have good outcomes to show for it, right? In terms of our health, in terms of the health outcomes, life expectancy, and so on and so forth. So we are spending a lot more than our peers, and we're not getting better outcomes. And the problem is that we're not getting more real healthcare, right? We're not getting more real resources. It's just that we're paying a lot more for it, right? In the form of higher medical costs, in the form of higher pay for a lot of medical professionals, right? And higher administrative costs, because our system is so inefficient that we're spending so much money to administer it, right? From billing departments in hospitals to all the insurance companies, obviously the middleman that's just taking their cut without really adding anything in terms of real care that people are getting, right? They're just there to take your money and then maybe or maybe not pay for you to get care when you need it, right? But they're not adding anything of real value. There is no real value added to the insurance industry. They're just, taking their cut. So if you were to get rid of all of that, right? So if you were to bring the US more in line with our peers, and obviously that would be a very generous estimate of how much Medicare for All could save us, right? So instead of spending 18% of our GDP on healthcare, if we were to spend something like 12%, 13%, right? Well, what does that mean in macroeconomic terms is that you're withdrawing those 5-6 percentage points of GDP worth of spending from your economy. So this is not the kind of program that would be inflationary for the economy. It could actually be deflationary because you're spending less, right? In real terms, you could think about all the people who work in insurance, in billing, right? All of those people would be unemployed if you were to cut those industries, right? If you were to transition to some kind of single payer system. Well, if you just did this program and you created all that unemployment, that would be a problem. But the good thing is that you could use some of those workers, right, for your greening projects that you have to do. I mean, you would probably need administrators for that as well, right? So then to the extent that a lot of the skills could be transferable, although not all of them are going to be transferable, then you could be getting these people other kinds of jobs, right, that would be more beneficial for the society because they would be helping us to green our economy. So we looked at some estimates and we didn't really say, oh, let's just say we're going to get to European level spending, right? We didn't say that, although that would have been, over the long term, maybe we could get there. But we just, again, looked at some estimates and we did some of our own calculations of how much we could save. And the numbers range from 1.58% of GDP to 4.5% of GDP. There was even a conservative think tank that did an estimate where they said, well, it's going to cost the government so much to do Medicare for all. But if you looked at their estimates, even their estimates showed that with Medicare for all, overall, we would be spending less on healthcare as a society, right? So even they came to those kinds of conclusions. So we kind of took a middle point and we said, okay, let's say we could, save something like 3.5, 3.6% of GDP. Well, this number then enters into your equation with a negative sign, right? Because now this is not a demand on your resources. In fact, it's releasing those resources. So in terms of the accounting, it's a negative rather than a positive, although for society, obviously that's the positive. All right. And then the last one is the job guarantee, which again, if you just look at the financial cost, you say, oh my God, it's going to cost the government so much. But then even the conservative think tank that came up with a $93 trillion number, they basically admitted that they are doing some double counting, but they kind of just mentioned that in passing and then moved along. So if you count it financially, right, and it's just the cost, but then you could use a lot of your job guarantee workers to do your greening projects, right? So to transition to a greener economy, whether it's retrofitting houses or doing some, environmental cleanup and so on and so forth. So you could use these workers for that. So then in that case, you have to net out some of those benefits, right, that you're going to get. So yes, on the one hand, it's a cost, right? People will be getting wages, they would be demanding, they would be adding to your aggregate demand. But on the other hand, they would be doing some of those jobs, which we've already calculated in that 5% of GDP number that I showed you earlier, okay? So we netted that out. So then our final numbers looked something like this. So 5% for greening the economy. The net cost of job guarantee in terms of resources was 1% of GDP. And then from that, we subtract the Medicare for all, right? As I said, it enters with a negative sign. And then ending the forever wars, all the resources that go to the Pentagon and the military industrial complex, we estimated that to be about 1%, to save us about 1%. And I think that number came from Bernie Sanders. So then that left us with a net resource cost of 1.3%, okay? And obviously, I'm happy to answer any questions about any of this. If any of this wasn't clear, I'm happy to further expand on it. But the point here is that when you're looking at the price tag and saying 5% of GDP to transition to a renewable economy or greener economy, more sustainable economy, that sounds like a lot, right? And from the get-go, you're saying this is not doable, even if, let's say, MMT is correct and money is not a problem. How are you going to free up so much of your resources? But then when you look at the rest of it, you say, well, you don't need 5%, right? You need less than that if you're going to do it in conjunction with some of these other programs, okay? All right. So, and of course, there is also that issue that I alluded to earlier, that our estimates of how much our economy can produce when it's operating at its potential are very, I don't want to say, they're not reliable, right? So, how much more room does the economy have to absorb spending? Well, it depends on your estimates of potential GDP, which keep getting revised up or revised down based on economic conditions. So for instance, what I have here is the blue line is the forecast for potential GDP that the Congressional Budget Office here in the United States came up with in January of 2007. So this is before the financial crisis, before the Great Recession, and so on. They said, this is what we think is going to be the trajectory of our potential GDP. And of course, when you look at the 2019 numbers, that's your green line. You see how much they had to revise it down, right? Because of the global financial crisis and because we left the economy to just, slug along, and that reduced our potential, or at least the estimates of the potential. And then the red line is our nominal GDP. So it's the actual GDP that we measure. So you can see that even when that GDP was already at its potential, right? So if you go back to that graph that I showed you earlier, you would see that those two lines were on top of each other there. But if you look at the blue line, right, which was our estimates of the potential in 2007, you can see how much below that we still are, right? So which one is the real one, right? Is the potential at the green line, or is it at the blue line, right? And if it's at the blue line, what does it mean in terms of how much more resources the economy has that can be used for whatever programs you want to implement, right? That's the question here. All right. So, and even looking at something like the capacity utilization index, and I'm not going to dwell too much on it, but since the 1970s, that's been on a downward trend in the United States. It sinks in times of recessions, right? The rate at which we're utilizing our productive capacity. This is not labor. This is just, think of it as the capital that we're utilizing. And we can see that it sinks in recessions and it recovers, but it never quite recovers to the pre-recession levels, and COVID is the exception there. With the COVID recession, it dropped and then it recovered to the pre-COVID levels. So in that sense, that was good. But even then, it didn't recover to the pre-Great Recession levels, right? So then, how much more of our capacity can we actually use, right? Because when we are looking at those estimates of our potential GDP, we have to have some idea of what is full utilization of capital, right? So then, depending on what assumptions you make about that, right, what is realistic, then you would come up with different estimates of your potential GDP, and therefore different estimates of how much more spending your economy could absorb. Can you still see my slides? Yeah, okay. For some reason, when I try to change it, okay, it's glitching a little bit. All right. So obviously, what we saw during COVID is that inflation can become an issue even before full capacity is reached. And the benign explanation for that is because you would hit bottlenecks, right? Those areas of the economy that achieve full employment, while there are other parts of the economy that are going underused, right? At the same time, we also saw that firms would actually limit capacity on purpose and instead choose to raise their prices in light of greater demand, right? So that's something I think that right now we have to think about it. And in a sense, I feel like progressives generally didn't really have a good response to the inflation question when it came to inflation in the United States. And so in that sense, they lost the public debate on this question, right? But of course, the bottlenecks are an important part of it, but also this idea that prices don't just happen, right? They're set by firms. So we have to be mindful of that whenever we're thinking about the potential price effects that could happen if we were to implement something like a Green New Deal. At the same time, we can have a shortage of certain kinds of skilled workers, right? As I will show you, the argument kept coming up with the Biden infrastructure plan and the CHIPS Act, which was supposed to bring a lot of those onshore the semiconductor production in the United States, and so on and so forth. If you're thinking about universal pre-K or free college or subsidized college, obviously there could be shortages of real resources there as well. I mean, care work in the United States is very undervalued, and therefore we don't invest in it sufficiently. Same thing about teachers and so on and so forth. So there's always there would be shortages there as well for certain if we were to actually implement programs like that. So the MMT approach then is that policy should be targeted to alleviate these bottlenecks, right? And it's not like we don't know what they are. I mean, energy is clearly a bottleneck, and in a sense, you're trying to solve that problem, but solving that problem itself necessitates that you use energy. And so, trying to transition to renewable energy requires energy as well. So then, you're trying to solve the problem, but you have to be mindful of the bottlenecks in this case. All right. So targeting spending, obviously, and then pacing it in a way where you could release the spending as you were releasing resources would be useful, right? But obviously, this then leads to the P word, right, which is the planning. There would have to be some kind of plan that the government, like strategic planning, right? I'm not obviously talking about like Soviet style plans, but you would have to have more of a role for the government, right? You couldn't just do, oh, we're going to impose tariffs and we're going to let the free market adjust kind of situation. You would need to have industrial policy and so on and so forth, right? For something like this. All right. Okay. So the resource crunch, right? Or the fact that MMT has been saying for so long that the scarcity of money is not the problem, scarcity of resources came to the forefront when the Biden administration passed, or during the Biden administration, when Congress passed the infrastructure bill and then the Semiconductor Act, and there were all these headlines in the news all the time that there's a labor crunch, right? We don't have specialized workers that we need, engineers and so on, that we need special kinds of engineers for semiconductors, but we don't have enough workers, to the point where we were importing workers from Korea, and they were like, well, Americans don't work hard enough. We don't want to come there, and things like that. And that was all in the news and so on and so forth, right? So this was really just illustrative of what MMT has been saying all along, that these are the things, these are the shortages and scarcities that you have to worry about, not money and finance, right? And so to the extent that taxes are an important part of your calculation, they're not there to finance your spending, obviously. They're just there to help you reduce demand as needed. And so in this sense, it's important what kind of taxes we impose, right? So this conservative idea that you are going to have to raise taxes, right, in the same amount that your spending is going to happen, and that's somehow necessary for policy. Of course, MMT thinks that's completely misguided, and instead you use taxes to try to achieve certain goals. So for instance, in the United States, there's all this uproar about Taylor Swift using her private jet and other celebrities and so on. And it's well known, right, that the wealthy contribute to climate change by using their private jets and by using their huge yachts, or the second one and the third one and the 10th one and so on. So if you don't want them to do it because it's a big contributor to climate change, this is where taxes could be very useful, right? You could tax those activities out of existence, right? You could impose such confiscatory taxes on those activities that you could reduce them significantly, right? Or completely drive them out of existence. This would be the kinds of taxes that would be useful. But in that case, of course, you would be raising no revenue if you were successful, right? Because you would be getting that activity out of existence. So then there is nothing else to tax, right? So then the revenue is not really in the calculation here at all. So so when progressives in the US were proposing things like a financial turnover tax or a tax on offshore income as a way to finance the Green New Deal, the MMT approach was that that's misguided. Those things could still be a good idea, they are, but you have to keep the eye on the prize, right? Are you trying to reduce financial speculation? If so, sure, a financial turnover tax makes sense. If you're trying to fight climate change, that's really not the kind of tax that is useful here. Okay. All right. And so when people in the United States and generally talk about fighting climate change, they kind of seem to imply that we've never had an economic challenge so big, right? That it's undoable because it's just the scope of it is just so grand, right? There's nothing we can do about it. And so one of the things we did in our paper, we said, well, we've had a situation like that, right? Where we had a major economic issue that needed solving, and that was World War II, right? World War II was a major economic event, so to speak, for the U.S. economy, because that's pretty much what got us out of the Great Depression, because it unleashed the government spending in the scale that had never been done in the U.S. economy, right? So we went back to Keynes's little pamphlet, How to Pay for the War, which basically makes the MMT claim, obviously, without calling it MMT, right? And Keynes basically says, if you're thinking about the war in these financial terms, you're not thinking about it correctly, right? The problem of the war is the problem of not having enough real resources. It's not a problem of money. And so planning for the war is a real resource problem. And it's simple. How much output can you produce if all of your resources are utilized? How much of that do you need for the war effort? And the rest is what's left for your civilian usage, right? But at the same time, you have created all this income, right? So anybody who's producing for the government is still earning income. But if they all turned around and spent their income trying to buy this limited amount of stuff that's available for civilian consumption, then they're just going to inflate the prices, right? And they're going to not get more real stuff because more real stuff is not available. Instead, they're just going to get less, but they're going to spend all of their income on it, or a lot of their income on it. So he says that's pretty much what happened after World War I, right? Or during World War I. People were just allowed to spend, and they spent, and prices went up. And so the average worker wasn't any better off after World War I than they were before, right? And that's what we need to prevent, he says. We need to prevent inflation so that those nominal income increases would actually translate to real income increases for workers, okay? And so he says we have to constrain consumption, and there are three ways we can do it. We can tax it away, and it was done to some extent, right? Both in the US and in the UK, and that's an important sort of tool in the government's toolkit when we're thinking about reducing aggregate spending at the macro level. We can also rely on voluntary savings, which is exactly what we did after World War I or during World War I, and it didn't really work. Because if I save and you don't, then it's not going to work, right? All of us have to agree to save, and that's just not going to happen at the level of the society as a whole. And the last one, which is Keynes's preferred solution, is that instead of taxing the income and taking it away or relying on voluntary savings, why not take some of the money away and promise to return it with interest after the end of the war, right? And in that way, you're solving two problems, actually. You're solving the problem of too much spending during the war, right? You're preventing people from spending that money because you're sort of forcing them to save, right? You're forcing them to put it into some kind of a savings account, so to speak. And then at the end of the war, when the government is withdrawing from the economy and now you don't have enough spending in the economy, that's when you unleash that private sector spending power, right? You allow them to spend out of those savings accounts and the interest that they've accumulated, and then you're solving the problem of there not being enough demand after the war, okay? And this was implemented in the UK to some extent, but not to a great extent. And Keynes is very clear here as well. He has a whole section there about taxing the rich, saying why that's not sufficient, right? Even if you took all of the income of the rich, there is still enough left to inflate your economy, right? So then he says taxing the rich is really not the solution, or cannot be the only solution, because even if you tax them at relatively high rates, they're still not going to reduce their consumption as much, right? Because they are wealthy and high income, and therefore they can still afford to spend, right? The voluntary savings he thought would be inadequate, and that's why he proposed the deferred compensation, which, as I said, was used in the UK, but not to a large extent. And apparently it was done in a very incompetent manner. So then, wasn't necessarily implemented in a good way. So here is a certificate of post-war credit. This is what they looked like. And people could get those by giving money during the war and then get their money back after the war by presenting these certificates. All right. But the important point is that during World War II, we were actually able to successfully control inflation. And of course, I'm not saying that all of that was done through macro measures like taxation and selling bonds and so on. A lot of it was because of wage and price controls, right? So that's definitely a part of it. But of course, we're not allowed to talk about that. It's not supposed to be even considered as a part of the government's toolkit anymore. But both the US and the UK were relatively successful in avoiding really high inflation during World War II, which was obviously in terms of scale much larger than World War I, which is when they had a lot of inflation. Okay. All right. And of course, I'll just talk a little bit about the Bidenomics and the Build Back Better, and then I'll conclude with that. So after the $5 trillion that we spent in 1 year, right, Biden came into office and he said, we are going to build back better. And he presented his 2 plans, which together totaled something like 4.1 trillion over 8 years, right? And so on an annual basis, there was $500 billion, right? And again, that sounds like a lot of money, but compare that to COVID, right? I mean, it's not even, it's nothing, right? It's a drop in comparison to the COVID spending that we appropriated in a year. And of course, the conventional wisdom about how are we going to pay for it? We have to, go to the rich and ask for their money so that we can afford to do all of this. And obviously it went nowhere. All we got out of this was a $1 trillion infrastructure bill, the bipartisan infrastructure bill, which didn't really meaningfully address any of the concerns, both in terms of climate change or Medicare for all, and of course not the job guarantee, nowhere in sight, right? And the silliness of that was very evident in terms of how the spending and the taxation were structured. So the spending was going to happen over 8 years, but taxes were going to be collected over 15 years, right? And that way you could say, oh, we're not raising taxes on an annual basis a lot, but here we're spending over 8 years, but still, so injecting spending for 8 years, but continuing to withdraw spending from the economy through taxation for 7 more years after the spending has stopped, right? And just because we could say we've been able to raise the $4.1 trillion that we're planning to spend, and we could say all of this is fully paid for, right? The pay for logic that just gets in the way of any positive social progress in the United States. And of course, this is the wrong-headed approach, right? We have to think about spending and taxation as doing 2 different things, right? And that's the functional finance approach to government finances, right? And it's okay to debate the goals of government policy, right? And hopefully they will be democratically determined. What's not debatable, it's the money portion, right? That we have the money, we know where to get it. The question is whether we have the resources and what is it that people want done, right? What is it that Americans want and everyone else in their respective countries wants. So just to summarize, tackling climate change is really about mobilizing resources, whether unemployed resources or shifting those that are currently employed, whether that's your healthcare sector or the fossil fuel sector and so on. And it's also about creating new ones. And of course, over the long term, these kinds of investments are deflationary, right? If you're investing in your infrastructure, you're expanding your economy's capacity to produce more in the future. So all else equal, even if it's inflationary in the short term, over the long term, right, it's going to make, say, energy cheaper, right? Which is one of the biggest bottlenecks in our economy. So the goal of spending is to allocate resources, and taxation can be used to release them. So we have to keep that in mind when we're thinking about policy and affordability and pay-fors and so on. And we don't really need any change of procedures, printing money and so on. And we do have to worry about inflation, however, and that can be avoided by focusing on resources, targeting the spending to the areas where there is unemployed resources, and so on and so forth. And I started on a pessimistic note, but I want to end on a more optimistic note. I feel like the right can dream big. You know, when a Republican president comes into power in the United States, everybody is scared. Oh my God, what are they going to do? And I'm thinking, but just a few years ago, you were saying we can't do anything, even though you were in power, right? So when you were in power, there's nothing we can do. When the right takes over, we are scared about everything that they can do, right? And granted that it's easier to break things than to put them together and build things, right? So there is that advantage that the right has, but I think that we have to think bigger and dream bigger, right? And just reimagine the limits of what's possible in terms of policy, right? And just keep asking for more so that we can at least get something, right? And those numbers that I showed you, I'm not going to bet money on that, right? There's a lot of uncertainty when you're making projections over something for 10 years, right? But what I would bet money on is the methodology, right? That methodology that I showed you, the MMT methodology for evaluating affordability, is much more valid and much more useful than simply just doing the mainstream calculating costs, adding it all up, and then calculating how much each tax-paying family has to pony up so that we can afford those programs, right? That's really not useful. It says nothing about the existence or lack of resources that you need for your programs, right? While the MMT approach is useful in that way that, this resource accounting can actually tell us if something is affordable or not, and if it's not, then what can we do about it? All right. I'll end here and see if anyone has any questions.
Thank you so much. What a brilliant presentation. I learned a lot from that. It's most excellent. Lots of nice comments in the chat too. I don't know if you can see the chat. There's a couple of questions there. Perhaps, Stephen, do you want to point out some of the questions from the chat to start off with?
Well, we could do. Let's.
There was one from William.
So many things people
good.
written down. I'm just scrolling back. William Thompson was one of the first to ask a question. He asked, did the paper attempt to include ecological savings from greening the economy, for example, less environmental cleanup and pollution? That's should we go one at a time?
Yeah, I think so. We ourselves didn't do the estimates for how much the greening itself would cost. We relied on some other estimates that that we included there. And I don't believe that they included the cost savings in that way, but we do mention in the paper that there would be less cleanup that we need to do so over the long term, right? So what we're saying is that these estimates probably underestimate the cost savings, right, that would be accruing to us because we now have less environmental cleanup. And you could say the same thing about healthcare, right? If people have access to healthcare, then hopefully a lot of health problems that become chronic problems could be avoided. And therefore, over the long term, you could be saving more than what these short-term estimates are showing us, right? Yeah, good point.
Can we go back a little further? There was a question from John.
Yeah, that was a bit later, actually. But yes, I was about to mention John's question. It's a long one. Do you want to read it out?
Okay, I'll try and summarize it. So I guess John's question is about framing and narrative, and what are your thoughts on trying to counter some of the prevailing narratives by using different terms and ideas for, I guess, wondering, he says, I wonder if agreeing to call money issuance government debt is a big problem. And
I think that's related a bit to two things. Warren Moser often talked about, although some of us not that keen on the term, but often talks about the net debt of the government, as he calls it, the net money supply.
yeah,
And of course, Scott and Stephanie have been talking a lot about moving away from having the government auction treasury bonds and instead either leaving reserves in the banking system, or maybe having the central bank issue securities instead, so that people got away from the government as household metaphor. Was that a big hurdle towards getting people to engage with your work on the Green New Deal? And how much influence did that work, do you think, actually have on people in Congress, on the Democratic Party generally?
On that front, I have no idea. Clearly, the fact that none of it is done, I would say, or nothing meaningful has been done on that front. I guess that's definitely disappointing, even though we did find somehow money like the 5 trillion, and I would say not a lot of it was wisely spent, right? I think it was spent in a way which exacerbated income inequality, which is always a concern when it comes to government spending, right? It was spent in a way that a lot of money was given to businesses, even though they weren't necessarily impacted by COVID, for instance. So there were a lot of issues with that. And I think that was not, over the long term, that was not a positive for the reputation of fiscal policy, I would say. So I think that was definitely an issue. I think the framing obviously is very, very important, right? Although that only goes so much, because we can see time and again that push come to shove, they will do the things that they feel like they have to do to save the system, right? So then to say that it's money is really the hurdle, it's really not money that's the hurdle, it's politics, right? That's the hurdle. And I don't really have a good answer for how we overcome that. I think one thing that MMT has been good on is that it's been consistent, right? So now the tax cuts are going to come into the picture again, and the Democrats will be screaming their heads off about how it's going to expand the deficit. And I think that's a mistake, because if you want to use the deficit argument against one policy, then you cannot then complain when the deficit is used against arguing against the policies that you do support. So on that front, I think MMT has stayed consistent during the 2016 tax cuts, saying that, oh, it's not a good idea, but not for the reason that you're thinking, right? And I think that's helpful. In terms of getting rid of government debt, I think that would actually go a long way towards clearing up misconceptions about government finances, and also not just about government finances and how the government spends, but also getting rid of once and for all of this idea that printing money is inflationary by nature, right? That if we just didn't issue bonds, then somehow that's going to be inflationary. I can guarantee you, if I ask my students what's inflation, there will be one or two who will always say inflation is when there is too much money. It's so ingrained in people that they think it's the definition of inflation, right? So, even people like Paul Volcker will say things like that, right? That we have this fiat currency, nothing stands behind it, and therefore the central bank has to be the guardian of it and protect it through inflation targeting and so on and so forth. So this misconception around money printing leads to a lot of problems, right? The inflation issue, the issue that the government is financially constrained and that like nothing stands behind the currency and so on. So I think we could clear up a lot of those misconceptions. Now, it actually, the government may be forced to do something about it, because there was reporting in Bloomberg, but that the government debt is so large now that those primary dealers that the government usually uses to auction the debt, their balance sheets are not sufficient anymore to be able to absorb the government debt. So they have to bid during those auctions for treasury bonds, but then they also have limits, right? Like the capital requirements and so on. So they cannot continue to do it given the projections for how much the debt is going to balloon. So maybe that might force some kind of a change in how Treasury debt is placed. Yeah.
Yes, it was interesting what you said about conservative governments too. And these things are easier for the Republicans to do if they wanted to.
Yeah, I mean, we are
Just
seeing that
don't
a lot of things can be done through executive orders, apparently,
Yeah.
and we just finding that out time and again, right?
Did you pick out something else, Gabby?
There's a question that just popped in to the chat from Danny Roberts, which I think is takes the discussion perhaps more out of the US, which is a good one.
Well, Yeva isn't originally from the US, so
exactly, and you have been bringing in other countries' perspectives as well. So Danny asks, what, if anything, would you add to the analysis to make it applicable in low-income developing countries such as India or Nigeria? I'm thinking about things like import availability, domestic industrial base, but open-ended question. I'm thinking about what less powerful countries can do in the context where the US and Europe aren't going to be playing a leading role.
Sure. So I think the answer to that question is related to just the MMT take that every nation that has its own currency has currency sovereignty. Now that sovereignty might be limited to different degrees in different places, depending on their lack or availability of real resources. And of course, what a lot of developing nations have is labor, which is a resource that they almost all have in abundance, and it's not being fully utilized, right? So how much of that can you utilize to try to fight climate change? So there are a lot of like low tech things that you can do for climate change, right? Every time I go to France, I see they have stripped off the facades of this apartment buildings, and they are they're adding insulation there. Okay. And then they're also changing the facade where you look at it, you think it's a newly built building. But lowering our energy needs through things like insulation, right? That doesn't seem like a high energy, demanding kind of, or high skill demanding kind of job, right? So I think there are a lot of low hanging fruit that you can do. At the same time, I think we have to recognize the limits of that, right? To the extent that you need technology like solar panels, for instance, right? Or electric cars and so on. And I'm generally not in favor of electric cars as a solution to our problems. I think everybody owning a Tesla or whatever EV you want to pick was never the correct solution. Relying more on public transportation and so on, I think that was the more correct approach in general. But to the extent that you do need technology that's not available, I think that's where the developed nations have a role to play, right? This is not an issue that developing countries can solve on their own. There has to be, and Fidel has been very vocal about this, right? That the developed nations have to pay for it. There has to be transfer of resources and technology and financial means, because it's not a problem that they can solve on their own.
Absolutely. There are quite a few questions that we've missed, so apologies. I see, Danny, you're on the screen now. I should have just got you to unmute and ask you your question. But thanks very much for that. Stephen, would you like to just pick out one or two more?
No, I think there've been loads of questions. There's been a lot of great ideas from people too, which will be interesting to read through. And I particularly liked Yeva's reference to Fidel's work, especially his recent work while he's been on leave from Denison University, working with African governments leading up to and during the most recent COP talks, where, of course, Global South countries were looking for, it's not right to call it aid, really, it's right to call it preparation payments towards the enormous costs of colonialism and the global north stealing the ecological space which would otherwise be available for countries in the global south, looking for relatively moderate transfers from the global north of what you might call hard currency and technology to transform their economies. For example, most African countries have very little solar power, and I don't know what the proportion is. I think it's something like 40% of people on the African continent don't even have guaranteed access to electricity at the moment, and of course being the ones in sub-Saharan Africa that amongst those suffering most from climate change. So what were they looking for? They were looking for I think it was something like $1.5 trillion a year, and they were offered virtually nothing, and that virtually nothing was not going to be grants anyway. It was going to be yet more debt.
Yep.
And there wasn't even really a guarantee of that until about 10 years from now, which is too late. So yes, people should definitely follow Fidel and look at his many interviews on the net. There's a lot to be learned there, and both Yeva and Fidel are amongst the amazing second and third generation of MMT economists who, when Donald Trump is no longer president, and he's not president of the world, so the rest of the world, while he is president, I think, I hope, are going to be instrumental in shifting economic policy in the direction that it needs to go for us to have a sustainable environment and social justice within countries and internationally, because the current shift towards the right around the world, although it's very scary, it's not going to last forever, and the pendulum is going to shift back. And when it does shift back, we need to be ready with our ideas, and we need to be ready with people like Yeva and Fidel in place to advise governments. So I would like to very warmly thank Yeva for talking with us today, for such a fantastic presentation, and for her work in the past and her ongoing work in the future. If you are interested in MMT and are a scholar, the compendium that she produced, edited with Randy Ray, if you can, the Elgar Companion to Modern Money Theory, I very strongly recommend that to you too. That's a very important academic resource, and we've been very lucky to hear from Yeva today. So I just think everybody should give her a round of applause and say thank you.
Thank you. Fantastic presentation. I'm sure people would love to see your slides if you're happy to share them.
Sure.
That would be great. And hopefully we can release this as a YouTube talk too. We might lightly edit it before we do that. And we'll share the link with everyone so they can come back.
We'll also take the liberty of encouraging future generations of Modern Money Lab students to watch this talk as well. So thank you again very much for doing it. Very grateful.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
you.
Thanks for having me.